Today in the book of Daniel, we're going to continue talking about the future. Ever since chapter 7, this has all been about Daniel's dreams about the future. They trouble him enough that God gives him the interpretation. Now, these interpretations we're going to talk about today don't give us what we want, but give us what we need as far as a picture of what God is going to do in the future. And we're going to talk about that future and this vision of Daniel in chapter 8 of the ram and the goat and what that means for the future of humanity. And we'll talk about that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. This is a real Bible study between friends, and we invite you to come sit in and join us as we continue in our study in Daniel. Today, we're going to be doing the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, and this is where Daniel has his second dream of future kingdoms. And we're going to see some principles for us that are going to continue today. In fact, reinforce some of the things that we've said earlier and get us thinking about the future. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and we're going to start in chapter 8, verse 1. Now, listen, you remember, Daniel is not a chronological book. It's not meant to be a diary by any means. In fact, the first verse of chapter 8 is 2 years after the first verse of chapter 7. So we'll see this. He went back, he talked about Darius back in chapter 5, the end of Belshazzar's rule. Then we went to Darius, the king of Persia, and then we went back to Belshazzar, the first year of his reign in chapter 7. And now we're going to see Daniel's second dream of future kingdoms. We'll see that. You want to read the first 14 verses of chapter 8? I'll try to keep up with you, and you go ahead and just read through this. And if you want to comment on something, just stop and comment on it. But we'll go through this first 14 verses and then do the interpretation at the end.
In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, our vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up loud. It's interesting with the horns. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we talked about the horns on the beast, and now we got more horns.
Yes, exactly. In fact, some of the horns, there's a direct correlation, but this idea of horns representing kingdoms is pretty clear from his first dream that he had. We're not told what kingdoms yet, but this idea of horns and big horns and little horns and horns coming up and other horns, this is definitely a word type of kingdom. One of the significant things that you've read in the first few verses is he was in the citadel at Susa, and he was by the river Elam. And at this moment in time when Daniel is writing this, Susa is not a citadel. It's a provincial town, because the kingdom that it's talking about here, the Medium Persian Empire, is not a big empire yet. But in his dream, he's sitting in this citadel, this capital of this kingdom, and he starts to describe some things. And it's very interesting that we see Susa mentioned as the capital of Persia in the book of Esther, where Ahasuerus, Esther's king, his capital is Susa. But this really bothers liberal theologians, because when this is written, this is a prophecy of the future where Persia and Media Persia are not on the scene yet. So this is already starting to be a future thing.
You have no way of knowing, that this is going to be a capital aside from God telling you.
Exactly. And he's saying, in my vision, I was standing in this capital in Susa. And you go, some versions say, I think it's Shusan or something like that, but it's this capital that Susa is the same capital that's mentioned in Esther as the capital of Persia. And with Ahasuerus reigning out of Susa. So anyway, let's continue on. Starting at verse 4, we're already seeing interesting things. So go ahead and keep reading.
I saw the ram budding westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast had seen before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns. And the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram's power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land.
Wait a second. Where is the beautiful land?
We're talking about the promised land, maybe?
Yeah, the beautiful land was a name that was given. If you look at that little number 1 over in verse 9, where it says beautiful land, if you go over to verse 9, let me go up here so you can see it. It's a word for Palestine. You see that?
Okay.
Right here. So it's what the Jews called Canaan or Palestine, was the beautiful land.
Okay.
So go ahead back to 10. So he went, this kingdom, this horn is going to go basically all over the earth, all the way up to and including the beautiful land of Palestine. Go ahead, verse 10.
It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice. And it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and profit. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply? Will the transgress cause with horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored.
Okay, now let's stop here and think about this. Did anything, while you were reading those, we talked about Susa, but did anything else jump out at you about this dream?
It's interesting that it seems to involve angels and demons, little angels and demons. I'm talking about the hope, that struck me.
Okay, now that is, we've talked about this before, where we see a term that's familiar from the New Testament, and we say, oh, that means angels, or that means demons. And in this particular case, it doesn't. If you remember the Abrahamic covenant God made to Abraham was that his descendants would be like the stars of the heavens. And so when it talks about stars here, it's not talking about angels, it's talking about the nation of God's people, Israel, and that this persecution that's going to happen from this horn that comes out of the four horns is going to be a persecution on Israel, and to the point where Israel is trampled.
Yeah.
And so we need to do a little research here when asking, who is it writing to and who is it writing about? We shouldn't put our New Testament assumptions because of words. If it says he is our salvation, that doesn't always mean spiritual salvation. It can mean he's our circumstantial salvation. He saves us out of the circumstances. So let's not make assumptions on that. But that's an interesting note. We're going to talk about a spiritual aspect of this dream of the future kingdoms. Did you notice anything else?
It's interesting. It talks about the sacrifices being the regular sacrifice, remove this daily sacrifice. I'm wondering if that maybe is talking about the Jews can't worship at the temple anymore. They can't
Okay.
regularly sacrifice because
And then
something's
it
coming.
gives this very weird time. It says 2,300 days, which is a little over 6 years if you take it that way. We're going to get there in a second, but this 2,300 days is really speculative. We don't know exactly what it means. There are those that say if you're talking about the morning and the evening as a day unit, it's really 1,200 and some days, which is almost 3.5 years. If you're talking about 2,300 days, that's a little over 6 years. And both of them line up by some scholars, depending upon what you believe. 3.5
Okay.
years as halfway through the tribulation of Israel, the final tribulation, and others, 2,300 days is the time when Israel is under some heavy persecution by a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And this is right before the book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha, or the historical period of the Maccabees, who were priest kings. And the priest kings, the Maccabees, reestablish the temple worship after Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll talk more about that as we go here. But now there's something else. We say, okay, this is starting to get speculative again when we talk about our prophecies. Let's go back to what we see in these verses. What is a common thing that you see in the four kingdoms? You see it in the ram, you see it in the goat, and you see it in the four kingdoms that come out of the goat. Read verse 4 and then jump down to verse 8.
I saw the ram charging toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against them. And there was no deliverance from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And then 8, thus the goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off.
Okay. Now, I want to, in the New American Standard in verse 4, it says, and he did as he pleased and magnified himself, became great in his own eyes, right? In verse 8, it says, then the male goat magnified himself. What does it say in the ESV?
I'm in BSD, but it says the goat became very great.
Okay. This idea of becoming very great.
In his own eyes.
Misses it a little bit about he becomes great in his own proclamation. He magnifies himself. He gives himself glory. And then down in verse 11, it says, it being the horn that grew out of the four horns, it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the boat. So one of the things we notice as a kind of a theme of the four kingdoms is they're great, but they're great in their own proclamation. And that's this translation in the New American Standard is they magnify their greatness themselves. And we see that as a common theme of human kingdoms is they magnify themselves as being powerful. We even see that in individual government leaders. We see Putin and Xi in China. We see it even in American leaders where it's all about how great they are, right? It's not just patriotism. This is self-magnifying, okay? And we're going to see that as a theme here, that all these kingdoms are not kingdoms that are raised up by God, that glorify God. They all are raised up and they glorify themselves. And we can see that as a kind of a theme as we look at our governments today. We shouldn't rely on or worship or even follow with faithfulness governments today because governments today magnify themselves. We should be looking for the opportunity to magnify God in our lives. And that theme goes right on through the New Testament. So that's an interesting observation.
Yeah,
then we get down
also that it echoes chapter 3 a little bit, where Nebuchadnezzar makes the golden statue. It's all about magnifying self.
My kingdom. Oh yeah. And God strikes him when he says, oh, this is great. Look at what I've done.
Yeah.
And God says, oh yeah, we'll see. So this theme continues that human agencies, human governments, even that come up with prophecy, are all about self, not about glorifying God. Not until we get to the kingdom that it talks about at the end of chapter 7, the Son of Man who glorifies the Father. All right, so now let's pick up and go with the interpretation of the dream, and we'll go back and forth a little bit here. But let's go with verse 15 and pick up on now we get the interpretation of the dream. And I love this in verse 13. Daniel basically overhears a conversation between two angels. And what one angel's asking the other one, how long is this supposed to happen? And the other angel said, well, 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then the holy place will be properly restored. And there's a lot of discussion on that. And God does not tell us exactly. Now, one thing that we do get directly, and we see, I've said very often, Kyle, that when God tells us about something in the future, he's perfectly capable of giving us the names and the specifics, right? Let's look at starting at 15 and just read on. And this is exactly what's going to happen. Let's look at 15.
When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai. And he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision.
Okay, now he's still in Ulai at the capital of Susa, at the citadel, in his vision. Okay?
Yeah.
And he hears a voice saying, hey, Gabriel. So one of the angels that was standing there, and this goes back even to chapter 7 where the angels were standing. Now he says, I heard a voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So now we're going to get the interpretation of the vision. So go ahead and start reading.
So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end.
Now that's a phrase I've got highlighted there. This is talking about the end times. Okay? The period of all these chapters from chapter 7 to the end of the book are all about the time of the Gentiles. And this is when Gentile governments are reigning over a defeated Israel. And it talks about from Babylon all the way to present times as the time of the Gentiles when Israel has not been brought to prominence and reigns with the king, the Messiah reigning, right?
Yeah.
It's now talking about the end of this period of the Gentiles. So we go back to that verse.
So it's not talking about the judgment day and time.
Final judgment. No, it's just talking about the times, the time of the end of the reign of all these kingdoms. There again, where we can't see a term and assume it means what it means in the New Testament. We need to see what it really is talking about here. And this pertains to the end of the time of the Gentiles here. So now go ahead with verse 18.
Now, while he was talking to me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, Behold, I am going to let you know.
And here he's going to use that term again. I'm going to tell you what's going to occur at the final period of the indignation. See, it's not a final period of judgment. It's the final period of the indignation. I think we ought to end here because the interpretation is really cool. And this begins to give us specifics. I've said often that prophecy gives us information, but it doesn't always give us the details that we crave. So we guess. And I've said in the past, if God wants to give us prophecy of a name, he'll give us a name. He does that with Darius. There's going to be a king coming whose name is Darius. And then he does it here in this when he starts naming names and says the second kingdom of the goat is Greece. And he gives this prophecy, and we're going to talk about this next week. But he gives this prophecy and names Greece when Greece wasn't a big world power. The word Greece, in fact, is translated from Greco-Macedonia. It's just a region It's not a superpower. And
Okay.
yet it names it prophecy. This is the area that's going to become this great king. And out of this Greco Macedonian region is going to come an empire. And it's going to get into that. And we see some obvious things that we can interpret that are historical facts that we can say, that's what it's talking about. And I think we'll do that next week. Okay.
All right.
So we're going to pick up from verse 15 and just go to the end of the chapter from 15 to 27. I don't want to pile too much stuff and cram it in and miss some things. But one of the takeaways
Great.
we can get today is God gives this vision of self-magnifying, self-proclaiming kingdoms. Look at me, I'm great. And it's just not that they are great, they proclaim themselves to be great.
Yes.
Okay. And we need to be suspicious of kingdoms, that it's all about the politics and it's all about the ruler. We need to watch out, including in the U.S. And
Yeah.
we'll continue this next week. We basically said the dream, but we don't know all what it means yet. The interpretation is coming next week. We see this principle of Bible study is we see words that as New Testament believers, we assume it means. For example, it could mean earlier it talked about God judges a nation. That's not the final judgment. Just because the word judging is used, that's not the great white throne judgment at the very end of history. We need to make sure we don't jump ahead and assume things. Next week is really exciting about the interpretation of the ram and the goat. Today we've been talking about the future and some things that God gives us that are certain about the future, some things that we frankly can't know about the future. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called Don't Worry, Today is Yesterday's Future. And I hope you enjoy it. It'll be a blessing to you. Listen, we're going to continue in our study in Daniel next week. And until then, God bless you.